The plains zebra mongoose reached the ditch line in the early afternoon when the light lay flat across the grassland and shadows shortened until they no longer offered clear separation. From above, the ditch appeared shallow. It cut across the plain in a loose curve, following no natural drainage pattern. Its edges were soft, rounded by time and trampling, its bottom filled with dust, dry plant matter, and scattered stones. Grass grew thicker along its margins, fed by occasional runoff and the slight retention of moisture below the surface. To most animals, it was cover. To the mongoose, it was conditional cover. The mongoose approached from the leeward side, body low, movement steady but unhurried. Its striped coat blended well with the broken pattern of grass and shadow, but pattern alone did not ensure safety. What mattered was whether the ditch still behaved like concealment. It stopped several body lengths from the edge and waited. Sound behaved differently here. The ditch absorbed it, flattening footfall and softening small movements. Smell settled low, drifting along the line rather than rising. Sight lines shortened sharply once inside. These were advantages. They were also limits. The mongoose slipped into the ditch and began moving along it, keeping close to one wall rather than the centre. This allowed faster exit if needed and reduced the chance of silhouette against the far edge. At first, the cover held. Grass leaned inward just enough to break outline. The ditch's curve concealed what lay ahead. The mongoose's movement blended into the shallow depression, its body disappearing whenever it paused. But the ditch was not uniform. As the mongoose advanced, the soil composition changed subtly. Sections where cattle had crossed repeatedly were more compacted. Grass there grew thinner, roots shallow, stems brittle. In these places, cover existed mostly in appearance. The mongoose noticed immediately. Grass that should have flexed instead snapped faintly when brushed. Dust lifted where it should not have. The ditch wall reflected more light here, its surface smoothed by repeated pressure. The mongoose slowed. Cover that failed noisily could be avoided. Cover that failed quietly was worse. A short distance ahead, the ditch narrowed and rose slightly. The far wall dipped, reducing the depth difference that had provided concealment earlier. From within, the change was gradual. From outside, it would be obvious. The mongoose stopped and listened. No predators were immediately visible, no movement in the open grass. But absence of threat did not mean presence of safety. The mongoose tested the narrowed section carefully, shifting its weight forward just enough to see how the grass responded. It did not part cleanly. It flattened, staying down, exposing bare soil beneath. That was the failure, not collapse, not sound, just loss of structure. If the mongoose moved through this section, it would leave a visible trace, pressed grass, disturbed dust, that would persist long enough to be read from a distance. The mongoose backed away half a step. It waited again. Prey movement along the ditch line had decreased here. Small rodents avoided this stretch, preferring areas where cover remained intact. Insects moved faster, less confident. The ditch was losing its role as a corridor. The mongoose adjusted its plan. Instead of continuing forward, it crossed the ditch at a shallow angle and climbed briefly onto the open plain. This was riskier in the moment but avoided committing to failing cover. Once on open ground, the mongoose moved quickly and low, covering the exposed distance in a short burst before dropping back into the ditch farther along, where depth increased again and grass thickened. Here, cover returned. The ditch deepened just enough to hide movement. The grass grew denser, its roots holding soil together. When brushed, it sprang back partially, erasing passage. The mongoose resumed its steady pace. Behind it, the failing section of ditch lay unchanged. From a distance, it still looked like cover. Only close interaction revealed that it no longer concealed movement. This was the danger. Cover did not end dramatically. It thinned. It lost memory. It stopped hiding passage and began recording it instead. The mongoose reached the end of the ditch line near a cluster of low shrubs and paused. From here, it could look back along the route it had taken. The intact sections were invisible from above. The failed section stood out subtly, its grass pressed, its outline shallow. Any predator scanning carefully would notice. The mongoose moved on. It would still use ditch lines in the future. They were too valuable to abandon entirely. But this one had changed. Pressure from hooves and time had altered its behavior. It was no longer concealment. It was suggestion. And suggestion was not enough when silence, not noise, marked the moment cover failed. The mongoose disappeared into the scrub, already revising its internal map. In open plains, safety rarely vanished with warning. More often, it faded quietly, until the ground itself began to tell on anything that trusted it too long. The mongoose did not return to the ditch line immediately after leaving it. It circled wide, moving through low scrub and scattered grass where cover behaved honestly, either present or absent, but never pretending. The open plain offered little concealment, but it also offered clarity. Movement there was visible, sound travelled, and mistakes announced themselves early. That mattered. From a shallow rise, the mongoose watched the ditch again, reading it from a distance rather than from inside. This angle revealed what had been subtle before. Sections where the ditch still functioned as cover appeared darker, their grass standing unevenly, edges broken and irregular. The failing section looked smooth by comparison, flattened, reflective, shallow. Uniformity was the signal. Predators noticed uniformity. The mongoose waited, allowing the heat of the afternoon to settle further. As the sun lowered slightly, shadows lengthened just enough to reintroduce contrast along the ditch walls. This changed how cover worked, not by restoring it, but by shifting where failure became visible. The mongoose moved again. This time, it approached the ditch at a point where the line bent more sharply, creating a natural blind spot. It entered briefly, then stopped, testing the ground and vegetation carefully. Here, grass still flexed under contact, bending and lifting again rather than collapsing flat. This section remembered passage only briefly. The mongoose advanced along this usable stretch, staying close to the inner wall where shadow lingered longest. It moved slowly, pausing often, not because prey was present, but because it was watching how the ditch responded to stillness. Stillness revealed weakness. Where grass remained pressed after a pause, cover was failing. Where it recovered partially, concealment still worked. The mongoose marked these transitions internally, creating a mental boundary between usable and unreliable segments. Prey behavior confirmed this map. A rodent appeared briefly along the ditch line ahead, then retreated almost immediately, not in panic, but in assessment. It avoided the smoother section entirely, choosing to cross open ground instead. That choice told the mongoose everything. Prey abandoned cover before predators did. The mongoose altered its hunting strategy accordingly. Instead of moving continuously along the ditch, it began to use it as a staging line, approaching along intact sections, then exiting deliberately at points where prey chose to leave cover. These exits became predictable. The mongoose waited near one such point, body low, motionless. The ditch behind it still absorbed sound. The open plain ahead remained exposed. A rodent crossed the ditch line cautiously, stepping out where grass was thinnest and soil most compacted. It paused, uncertain, then committed to crossing the open ground. The mongoose launched. The burst was short and decisive. The rodent had left concealment too early, trusting the ditch behind it rather than the ground ahead. The mongoose closed the distance quickly and ended the chase before it extended. After feeding, the mongoose did not return to the ditch immediately. It moved away, cleaning itself in sparse shade, then circled back along a different approach. Repetition along the same exit point would invite detection. As the afternoon wore on, wind picked up slightly, flattening grass intermittently. This accelerated the failure of already weakened sections. Where cover had thinned earlier, it now vanished entirely under pressure. The ditch was changing even within the same day. The mongoose adjusted again, shortening its use of the ditch line and relying more on parallel movement through scrub. The ditch became reference rather than route. a line to read rather than follow. By late afternoon, the mongoose crossed the ditch one final time at a deeper section and left it behind. From the far side, it paused and looked back. The failing section was now obvious even from this distance. Grass lay flat, soil exposed, the shallow depression offering no concealment at all. The intact sections remained visually broken, irregular, harder to interpret from afar. Any predator scanning would notice the difference. The mongoose moved on. The lesson had deepened. Cover did not disappear all at once. It failed first by becoming consistent, by losing the small irregularities that absorbed attention and erased passage. Once that happened, movement along it no longer vanished. It accumulated. The ditch line still existed, but it no longer hid. And for an animal that survived by staying just inside the edge of notice, that was the moment a route stopped being protection and became evidence. The mongoose disappeared into the grassland beyond, carrying a revised map, one that treated silence and smoothness not as safety, but as warning that cover had already ended. The change did not arrive with noise or new shapes. It arrived as timing. The mongoose noticed it early the next morning, when the ditch line should have held cool shadow longer than the surrounding grassland. Instead, light reached the bottom sooner than expected, reflecting faintly off compacted soil. Shade was thinning. The mongoose approached from downwind, stopping short of the ditch. From here, the smell was clearer than before: dry dung, crushed grass, and the faint metallic trace of machinery that had passed nearby days earlier. Cattle had used the ditch again, not enough to destroy it, enough to regularize it. Hooves did not collapse the ditch walls, they pressed them. Each crossing shaved small irregularities away, smoothing edges that once broke outlines. Grass along the rim no longer leaned at varied angles. It grew in flattened bands, stems aligned by repeated pressure. This was worse than bare ground. Bare ground announced itself. This still looked like cover. The mongoose entered cautiously. Inside the ditch, sound no longer softened as it once had. Footfall echoed faintly, not loudly enough to warn prey, but enough to betray movement to anything listening closely. The soil underfoot felt firmer, less absorbent. Compaction had reached depth. The mongoose stopped and waited. Nothing moved. Not because the ditch was safe, but because nothing used it anymore. Prey avoided this line now. Rodents crossed it only at night, if at all. Insects moved across it quickly, without lingering. The ditch had lost its function as a corridor. The mongoose advanced anyway, mapping. As it moved, it noticed something more subtle. Where hooves had crossed repeatedly, grass no longer sprang back at all. It stayed pressed, even without wind. These flattened zones formed a faint pattern, parallel lines that followed livestock movement rather than the ditch's curve. The ditch was being overwritten. Its original shape mattered less than how often something passed through it. Farther along, a shallow vehicle rut intersected the ditch, not deep enough to matter structurally, but enough to alter drainage slightly. After rain, water would pool here briefly, then drain unevenly. This had thinned grass roots further. Cover failed fastest here. The mongoose tested the intersection and immediately retreated. The soil reflected light differently, smoother, lighter. Any movement here would be recorded instantly. The mongoose shifted strategy again. It stopped treating the ditch as linear cover entirely. Instead, it used short, intact fragments of it as temporary shelter, entering briefly, then exiting at oblique angles to avoid leaving continuous trace. Hunting adapted accordingly. Rather than ambushing from within the ditch, the mongoose began waiting outside it, using the ditch only as a visual boundary that prey still respected instinctively. Rodents hesitated near it, uncertain whether to cross open ground or risk the compromised cover. That hesitation was enough. The mongoose caught prey not in the ditch, but just beyond it, where prey abandoned a line that no longer protected them. By midday, heat rose again, flattening grass further and accelerating loss of structure. What little concealment remained thinned visibly. The ditch was becoming part of the plain rather than separate from it. The mongoose left. It moved toward an older drainage line farther away, deeper, steeper, less trafficked. Reaching it took longer, crossing open ground that offered no cover at all. But that ground was honest. Nothing pretended to hide there. Before disappearing into the taller grass beyond, the mongoose paused one last time and looked back. The ditch line was still visible, still shaped, still shaded in places, but it no longer erased passage. It no longer absorbed sound or memory. It had become a smooth, readable feature, an outline that drew attention instead of dissolving it. That was the final failure. Cover had not collapsed. It had been used smooth. And the most dangerous change had not been the arrival of hooves or wheels, but their repetition, applied gently enough that nothing broke, yet persistently enough that everything that once hid movement quietly disappeared. The mongoose moved on, carrying the lesson forward. In open plains, danger did not always come from exposure. Sometimes it came from routes that still looked safe, long after they had stopped protecting anything that trusted them.